August 6, 1942. The aircraft carrier Zuikaku lay at anchor in Truck Lagoon, its deck crews working in oppressive humidity. Deep within the ship, in a steel-walled briefing room clouded with tobacco smoke, 6 Japanese naval officers hunched over a table strewn with reconnaissance photographs, damage assessments, and production forecasts. They had been deliberating for nearly 4 hours. For the past 15 minutes, no one had uttered a word. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi finally shattered the suffocating silence. "Gentlemen, we must face what these figures are screaming at us. This war cannot be won." The room stayed deathly quiet. Nobody challenged him. Nobody needed to. The truth had become inescapable. August 6, 1942, exactly 8 months since Pearl Harbor, exactly 2 months since Midway. The war's momentum had shifted irreversibly, and Japan's admirals were confronting a horrifying realization. The very attack meant to cripple American naval might had instead sealed Japan's doom. To understand how these experienced naval commanders reached such a devastating conclusion, we must return to where it all began. The perfect attack that failed. December 7, 1941. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's meticulously orchestrated strike delivered tactical perfection. 6 Japanese carriers launched 353 aircraft in 2 waves. The results appeared spectacular. 8 American battleships sunk or crippled, 188 aircraft obliterated, 2,403 Americans killed. News of the victory electrified Tokyo. Celebrations erupted across Japan. The Americans had been caught completely unprepared, but cracks in the victory appeared immediately to those scrutinizing the details. The American aircraft carriers, the real instruments of modern naval warfare, were absent. Enterprise was returning from Wake Island. Lexington was ferrying aircraft to Midway. Saratoga was in San Diego. All 3 remained untouched, their crews unaware how narrowly they'd escaped destruction. The massive fuel tank farms at Pearl Harbor, containing over 4–5 million gallons of precious oil, hadn't been targeted. The submarine base emerged unscathed. The repair facilities, the dry docks, the machine shops, all remained operational. Within months, these facilities would resurrect several of the destroyed battleships. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the air attack, had pleaded for a 3rd strike wave to finish the job. He wanted those fuel tanks destroyed, those repair facilities obliterated. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo refused. Nagumo worried about American counterattack, about depleting his forces, about pushing his luck. He ordered the fleet to withdraw. History would judge that decision harshly. Yamamoto himself understood the precariousness of Japan's position. Intelligence assessments landing on his desk in late December 1941 painted a sobering picture. Japan had perhaps 6 to 9 months before American industrial capacity began generating overwhelming numerical superiority. 6 to 9 months to win the war, consolidate conquests, and force negotiations. The clock started ticking on December 7th. The window slams shut. By August 1942, that narrow window had not merely closed, it had been welded shut and buried under rubble. The Battle of Midway in early June proved catastrophic beyond Japan's darkest projections. 4 fleet carriers lost in a single day: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. But the admirals meeting on Zuikaku understood these weren't merely ships. They were floating cities of aviation expertise, manned by irreplaceable pilots who had trained for years. Each carrier represented a massive investment in infrastructure, training, and combat experience that couldn't be replicated. Japan began the war with 10 fleet carriers. By August, 6 remained operational, with 2 requiring extensive repairs. The margin for error had evaporated. Meanwhile, American shipyards operated at a tempo that defied Japanese comprehension. Intelligence reports spread across that briefing table revealed over a dozen Essex-class carriers under construction. These weren't desperate conversions of merchant hulls. These were purpose-built fleet carriers, larger and more capable than anything Japan could produce. The first would enter service in early 1943. By 1944, Intelligence projected the Americans would possess such overwhelming numerical advantage that Japanese defensive strategy would collapse into impossibility. Captain Fuchida, now recovering from wounds sustained at Midway, presented an analysis that sucked the oxygen from the room. He had calculated pilot attrition rates, training throughput, and combat readiness. The numbers told a story of approaching catastrophe, the death of expertise. Japanese naval aviation entered the war with approximately 3,500 carrier-qualified pilots. These weren't merely competent, they were among the most skilled aviators on Earth. Their training regimens were brutal, comprehensive, lasting years. By December 1941, veteran Japanese carrier pilots had logged over 800 flight hours each. They could land on pitching carrier decks in darkness. They could navigate vast ocean expanses by dead reckoning. Their torpedo attacks achieved precision that bordered on supernatural. By August 1942, 40% of them were dead. Coral Sea killed dozens. Midway killed hundreds more. The grinding Solomon Islands campaign was consuming the survivors like a furnace, with pilots flying multiple sorties daily, their nerves shredded, their bodies exhausted, their skills degrading from relentless operational tempo. Japan's pilot training programs produced perhaps 100 new carrier-qualified aviators monthly. These replacements arrived with roughly 200 flight hours, a quarter of what the veterans possessed. They were brave, dedicated, and woefully unprepared for combat against increasingly experienced American pilots. American pilot production told an entirely different story. Training facilities across the United States were graduating thousands of pilots monthly. Their initial training was less intensive, but the sheer volume meant losses could be absorbed and replaced continuously. American pilots gained experience by surviving missions. Japanese pilots gained experience but couldn't be replaced once lost. Fuchida's projection was clinical and merciless. At current attrition rates, Japan would exhaust its pool of experienced carrier pilots by mid-1943, regardless of how many carriers remained afloat. You cannot operate aircraft carriers without skilled pilots. The mathematics were inescapable. The industrial avalanche. The aircraft production figures were equally devastating. In 1941, American factories produced approximately 19,000 military aircraft. Japanese factories managed roughly 5,000, a significant gap but not hopeless. But the gap wasn't static, it was exploding exponentially. American production accelerated every month. New factories opened. Assembly lines refined techniques. The arsenal of democracy was hitting its stride. Intelligence estimates projected that by 1943, the United States would produce 85,000 aircraft annually. Japan, struggling with resource shortages and limited industrial capacity, might produce 16,000 if everything proceeded perfectly. This meant that by late 1943, America would produce more aircraft in a single month than Japan produced in an entire year. Admiral Yamaguchi spread reconnaissance photographs across the table, aerial images of American shipyards taken by long-range patrol aircraft. The photographs showed construction on a scale that seemed almost fantastical. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, all in various stages of assembly, simultaneous at multiple yards up and down both coasts. One officer remarked that it looked like America was building ships the way Japan built bicycles, on assembly lines, in vast quantities, with standardized components. This wasn't war as Japan understood it. This was industrial output applied to military problems, and Japan simply couldn't compete. The strangling begins. The submarine warfare analysis proved even grimmer. Japanese submarines, despite sophisticated designs and capable crews, had achieved minimal strategic impact. They operated primarily in fleet support roles, hunting warships rather than merchantmen. Japanese naval doctrine viewed commerce raiding as somehow ungentlemanly, beneath the dignity of the Imperial Navy. American submariners harbored no such reservations. Admiral Yamaguchi presented merchant shipping loss statistics that illustrated Japan's approaching strangulation. In January 1942, Japan lost 15 merchant vessels. By June, losses reached 30 ships monthly. August saw 40 ships sent to the bottom. The trend line climbed with terrifying consistency. Japan's entire economy depended on imports: oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, iron ore from China and Korea. All of it required transport through increasingly lethal waters. Every merchant ship loss diminished Japan's ability to sustain both civilian economy and military operations. Japan's shipbuilding capacity could produce perhaps 200,000 tons of merchant shipping annually. They were losing 300,000 tons per year, and losses accelerated monthly. By 1944, if trends continued, Japan wouldn't possess sufficient merchant tonnage to maintain basic economic function, much less support far-flung military garrisons. The oil situation deserved special attention. Seizing the Dutch East Indies oil fields had been a primary war objective. Japan succeeded brilliantly. The fields were captured largely intact. Production resumed quickly. Mission accomplished. Except the oil had to reach Japan. Tankers had to transit thousands of miles through submarine-infested waters. In January 1942, Japan imported 400,000 tons of oil from the Indies. By August, imports dropped to 250,000 tons. American submarines were devouring tankers faster than Japan could replace them. The projection was nightmarish. By 1943, Japan might control vast oil fields, but lack the means to transport the oil home. The lifeblood of modern warfare would sit in storage tanks in Sumatra, while Japanese aircraft sat grounded in Kyushu for lack of fuel. The strategic trap. Japan's rapid conquests created an enormous defensive perimeter stretching thousands of miles. The Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, New Guinea, dozens of Pacific islands, all required garrisons, all needed supplies, all demanded reinforcement if attacked. Japan had to defend everywhere. America could attack anywhere. This fundamental asymmetry meant that even with equal forces, the Americans possessed inherent advantage. But forces weren't equal. American strength grew while Japanese strength declined. One admiral suggested negotiated peace. Perhaps if Japan offered to return some conquered territories, America might agree to ceasefire, accepting Japanese control of strategic resources while ending the fighting. The suggestion provoked bitter, exhausted laughter. These admirals had all read intelligence summaries of American public opinion. Pearl Harbor hadn't merely angered Americans, it had united them with an intensity Japanese planners never anticipated. The attack, designed to demoralize America into negotiations, had instead created absolute determination to destroy Japan completely. War bond drives were oversubscribed beyond projections. Factories operated around the clock. Women entered shipyards and aircraft plants in unprecedented numbers. Rationing was accepted without complaint. America had transformed into a total war economy with frightening speed. There would be no negotiated peace. Americans wanted unconditional surrender, total victory, complete defeat of Japan. Pearl Harbor had guaranteed that. What went wrong? The meeting turned to uncomfortable analysis. What exactly had gone wrong? Pearl Harbor achieved its tactical objectives, battleships destroyed, Americans shocked. Why had it proven strategically catastrophic? Admiral Nagumo offered his assessment. The attack was designed to destroy American battleship power, providing Japan 6 months to consolidate conquests before America could respond effectively. The theory assumed that after 6 months of defeats, American public opinion would force government to negotiate favorable peace terms. Every assumption in that theory proved wrong. First, battleships weren't the decisive weapon system. Carriers were. By missing the American carriers at Pearl Harbor, Japan left America's most critical naval assets untouched and operational. Second, American psychology had been completely misunderstood. Far from demoralizing Americans, the attack unified them. Isolationist sentiment evaporated overnight. Pearl Harbor handed President Roosevelt exactly what he needed, a nation demanding war. Third, the attack appeared treacherous. Japanese diplomats were supposed to deliver a declaration of war 30 minutes before aircraft struck. Due to decoding delays, the declaration arrived after the attack commenced. This made Pearl Harbor seem like a sneak attack, a violation of international norms. American propaganda labeled it a date which will live in infamy, and that characterization stuck. Japan had handed America perfect moral justification and a rallying cry that would sustain American war effort for years. Fourth, Pearl Harbor gave America international moral high ground, making alliance building and resource acquisition easier. Britain, China, and later, the Soviet Union found cooperation with America natural. Japan became increasingly isolated, the Doolittle effect. Admiral Yamaguchi retrieved another document, an analysis of the Doolittle raid from April 1942. 16 B-25 bombers launched from the carrier Hornet bombed Tokyo and other Japanese cities, then flew to China. Physical damage was minimal, a few buildings destroyed, dozens of casualties. Militarily insignificant. Strategically, the raid devastated Japan. It shattered the myth of homeland invulnerability. It proved American carriers could approach Japan itself. It forced Japan to retain aircraft and troops in home islands for defense, resources desperately needed elsewhere. Most critically, the raid prompted Japanese high command to accelerate the Midway operation. The plan was to lure American carriers into a trap, destroy them, and eliminate the threat of future raids on the home islands. Instead, American codebreakers read Japanese communications and knew exactly where and when the attack would come. The hunters became the hunted. 4 Japanese carriers went to the bottom in a single day. The Doolittle raid's minimal physical damage had triggered a chain of events that crippled Japanese naval aviation. 16 bombers had accomplished what 100 might not have. Intelligence failure. The code-breaking issue haunted every discussion. Japanese naval codes were being read by American cryptanalysts. The admirals didn't know the full extent of the compromise, but they knew enough to be deeply alarmed. Every operation plan, every ship movement, every strategic intention was potentially known to the enemy before execution. Fighting a war when your opponent reads your orders approaches impossibility. It's like playing poker with your cards face up while your opponents remain hidden. Security failures extended beyond codes. Japanese radio discipline was poor. Traffic analysis revealed fleet movements even without breaking codes. Japanese pilots radioed in plain language. Intelligence leaks from neutral countries provided Americans with detailed information about Japanese deployments. Meanwhile, Japanese intelligence gathering proved inadequate. They consistently underestimated American production, misread American intentions, and failed to penetrate American codes with equivalent success. Paths not taken. The admirals examined alternatives. What if Japan hadn't attacked Pearl Harbor at all? What if they'd only struck British and Dutch colonial possessions while avoiding American targets? Would America have entered the war? The consensus was uncertain. President Roosevelt clearly wanted war against both Germany and Japan, but American public opinion in 1941 was profoundly isolationist. Without Pearl Harbor, would Congress have declared war? Possibly not immediately. Japan might have gained months or years to consolidate conquests without American opposition. Instead, Pearl Harbor gave Roosevelt exactly what he needed. By the evening of December 7th, isolationism was dead. Another alternative. What if Nagumo had launched that third strike wave? What if Japanese aircraft had destroyed the fuel storage, repair facilities, and submarine base? The damage would have delayed American Pacific operations by 6 months, perhaps longer. 6 months Japan desperately needed. But the admirals acknowledged an uncomfortable truth. Even a more thorough Pearl Harbor wouldn't have changed the ultimate outcome. The fundamental problem wasn't tactical execution, it was strategic reality. Japan's economy was roughly one-tenth the size of America's. Japan's industrial capacity was a fraction of America's. Japan produced essentially no oil domestically. Japan's population was less than half of America's. In a protracted war of attrition, these disparities guaranteed defeat. It was mathematics, not morale, numbers, not courage. Yamamoto had understood this from the beginning. He opposed war with the United States, arguing Japan couldn't win a protracted conflict. He was overruled by army leaders and civilian officials who believed American democracy was weak, that Americans were soft, that quick victories would force capitulation. Every assumption was proving catastrophically wrong. American democracy, far from being weak, had mobilized with terrifying efficiency. Americans, far from being soft, were displaying casualty tolerance that exceeded Japanese projections. Quick victories had given way to grinding attrition that favored the side with greater resources. The current situation. The admirals reviewed the immediate tactical situation. American forces had landed on Guadalcanal in early August. Japanese forces were fighting desperately to dislodge them, but the admirals recognized what Guadalcanal represented: a new American strategy. Seize a forward base. Build an airfield. Use that airfield to dominate surrounding waters. Advance to the next target. Repeat. It was methodical, grinding, and devastatingly effective. Japan couldn't match this approach. Japanese logistics were inadequate. Japanese industrial production couldn't provide sufficient aircraft, ships, and supplies to match American reinforcement rates. Every battle was becoming a battle of attrition, and Japan was losing every attrition calculation. One final document made the rounds, an economic analysis from the Finance Ministry. It projected Japanese economic capacity through 1945 under various scenarios. Even the most optimistic projections showed economic collapse by late 1944. Japan's economy simply couldn't sustain the war effort beyond 3 years total. They were 8 months into the war. The clock was ticking. The unspoken conclusion. The admirals reached their devastating conclusion through shared silence rather than formal pronouncement. Pearl Harbor had been a tactical success, but a strategic catastrophe of historic magnitude. It achieved nothing Japan needed, while unifying and enraging the one opponent Japan absolutely had to avoid fighting. The war was unwinnable. The only question was how much destruction Japan would endure before accepting the inevitable. Admiral Yamaguchi suggested recommending immediate peace negotiations to higher command before the situation deteriorated further. The proposal was rejected, not because the admirals disagreed with the analysis, but because they knew such recommendations would be ignored or, worse, treated as defeatism and treason. The military government wasn't interested in uncomfortable reality. They were committed to fighting to the bitter end, no matter the cost. The weight of knowledge. The meeting concluded without decisions, without recommendations, with only shared understanding of terrible truth. Japan had lost the war on December 7, 1941. The nation just didn't know it yet. These admirals did know. They would carry that knowledge through the next 3 years, planning operations they knew couldn't succeed, fighting battles they knew were lost, watching young men die for a cause that was already defeated. They filed out of that steel briefing room on Zuikaku, returning to their duties, carrying the crushing weight of foreknowledge. The war would continue for 3 more years. Millions more would die. Cities would burn. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. It never had been. August 6, 1942. The day Japanese admirals knew Pearl Harbor was a fatal mistake.